What is up, Coordination? On the pod today, we are talking to Puja Ohlhaver, who is a lawyer, innovator, and technologist in Healthcare and Web3. She is a member of the Getting Plurality Research Group at the Harvard Center for Ethics, and you probably know her as the co-author with Glen, Weyl, and Vitalik Buterin of the Decentralized Society paper, Finding Web3's Soul. Puja's writing has been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, Politico, and Wired, and she previously practiced law at in ARPS and founded a women's healthcare company. She writes and thinks about many issues and mainly focuses on the intersection of technology and politics and economics. And that is what we were talking about on the podcast today. We are talking about Stellarpunk, which is a synthesis of her thinking about the memes of SolarPunk and LunarPunk and incorporating them and extending them into this idea of Stellarpunk. What would it look like if our memes were as plural as the night sky, if our light came from many parts of the night sky? And so we talk about some of the problems and criticisms of SolarPunk and LunarPunk, and we talk about what would have to be true to transcend and include those paradigms into all of the light in the north sky. So plurality, decentralization, funding public goods, and managing the differences between individuals and collectives are big themes of this episode. And I just think that Puja is this really impressive writer and thinker because we go deep in some spots into mechanism design. I found myself Googling things that she was saying during the episode because she's so deep and articulate on mechanism design, but then we come back up to the mimetic level and the aesthetic level of the world that we're trying to create. And it's the synthesis of those things that I think is one of the beauties of this episode. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play for the next 5 minutes the talk that Puja gave at the Plurality conference about Stellarpunk, and then you're going to listen to our interview about Stellarpunk. So I think that you're really going to enjoy the conversation about Stellarpunk. And without further ado, I give you Puja Ohlhaver.
ValleyDAO is an open global collective working to finance and democratize the governance of synthetic biology technologies to protect the future of our planet. Research and progress into synthetic biology is critically constrained by the world of nation-state regulations and bureaucracy from middlemen. But the potential that synthetic biology has for the world is massive. It can produce a world in total harmony with nature. We can grow stuff using cells like software. It's awesome. And the best part is we no longer have to pull carbon out of the ground to grow and maintain civilization. Don't you think we should be funding this? ValleyDAO does, and that's what they're here to do, to try and make the SolarPunk world of tomorrow a reality today. So join ValleyDAO right now and save the planet at valleydao.bio.
Okay, so I think I'm probably the only speaker who probably took this question quite literally on what is plurality's North Star. Plurality does not have one North Star, it has many. And like stars, all of us are here in this room, hurtling through space-time, radiating out our beliefs and desires, just like light. So some might think the question of plurality is, how do we keep our light as differentiated as the stars we see in the night sky? Some might say differentiate in markets. Okay, well that's truly better than being told what we want, which would certainly diminish our light. But are all preferences expressed in this way, in monetary trades? Well, we also reveal what we want when we talk or trade time. And increasingly, we talk on digital channels which trade access for our data. And this challenges our plurality in several ways. First, channels make money by maximizing engagement and auctioning off our data, as we know. And it turns out we are most engaged when we are in conflict. So instead of surfacing consensus, today's digital channels nudge conflict, reducing our plurality into polarity on a collision course. Second, channels hoover up our data, accumulating the power to build monolithic AIs that perhaps know us better than we want and can manipulate our preferences in ways that we can't see or know. This risks collapsing us from plurality into black hole singularity. So how do we avoid both singularity and polarity in favor of this third way, plurality? There are lots of open questions about communication channels. What are they? Questions about speech norms, questions about privacy and the uses of shared data, questions about even the structure of the pipes themselves, And all of these questions are actually interrelated. So who decides and how do they decide? $1, one vote, one person, one vote, one token, one vote. And how do we express and balance all these participants' preferences? Well, we can learn from the stars. It turns out, actually, that light intensity decreases inversely proportional to the square of the distance from the star. If brightness didn't diminish by an inverse square law, but was, for example, linear, light would envelop the whole sky and we would lose differentiation. Similarly, rather than having people linearly project the intensity of their preferences and drown out all other voices, what we want is greater marginal cost to more influence. Now, quadratic voting is very interesting, and it does this by making the next vote more expensive than the first, proportionally increasing the cost of more influence. And interestingly enough, the same is also true of gravity. If it didn't diminish by an inverse square law, stars would collapse into each other. But is quadratic voting really all that we need to find consensus across all of our lights in this room? Essentially square rooting over the intensity of our brain's preferences? Or is something missing? Heart. Or the greatest mystery of the universe, love. Where does our light, our beliefs, our desires, our preferences, which we project out, come from after all? Well, it turns out we are social beings born into a set of solidarities, starting with our family, school, and neighborhoods. As we age, we differentiate and broaden our communities, growing a rich network of overlapping memberships with different magnitudes of affection, which change over time, as well as the communities themselves, which are in perpetual stochastic recombination. And like stars, as we age, we contract, our solidarities shrinking, and perhaps our intensity increasing. Now, these communities look like communication channels, which I've drawn before, and that's because they are bound by norms and values. And it's through these channels that we form and evolve our preferences and even language norms to express them. And because our preferences are emergent from these conversations, simply making the cost of our influence proportional to how much we care isn't enough. We also need to discount how biased or influenced we are by the conversations and the channels themselves. So, returning to the analogy of stars, on the macro level, we look like these self-sovereign stars, right, flying through the universe, emanating preferences, which we square root over so we can differentiate and see the light from other stars. But light is also a wave. It can have properties instantaneously entangled with other light waves across vast distances. And so what we really want to know is underneath the intensity of our preferences, how correlated or entangled are they with other people's by this invisible, messy, stochastic social process we call communication. Our light may seem differentiated and idiosyncratic on the surface, but may be correlated with other light waves across vast differences and distances. So, in fact, digital communication channels do just that, create greater entanglements across distance. So, recognizing this intimate connection between our preferences and our solidarities, our light and our loves, helps us guard against both the evil of bias or spin of correlated groups, which threaten to collapse us into their singularity, and profitable collision courses which enrich one group or a set of groups at everyone else's expense. And instead, we find a third way, channels governed by consensus, not only across many light, but different kinds of light and different kinds of stars, drawing on the shared wisdom of different kinds of light and many lights and many kinds of stars to continue expanding a possibility space for infinite recombination entanglements that rival the plurality we see dotting the night sky. Welcome to Stellarpunk, a new paradigm. Bring your brains, hearts, and your square roots.
Hey, Puja, how's it going?
Hey, Kevin. Going well, thank you.
So glad to have you here to talk about Stellarpunk. Maybe we'll work our way up to that with talking about SolarPunk first. So what is SolarPunk to you?
This is, by the way, just generated from my observations on memes and Twitter and the internet. But generally, I would characterize it as being motivated by this desire for transparent infrastructure, for funding public goods with this optimistic belief that public access to a decentralized, transparent financial and non-financial system leads to better outcomes. And a couple things I think SolarPunk gets right, this emphasis on regeneration and reinvestment with novel mechanisms to achieve that, which of course Gitcoin has been a major part of, as well as other protocols like optimism. Some of these mechanisms, of course, quadratic voting and quadratic funding, And I will just assume the listeners here don't have much exposure, or just kind of quickly say what I think is great about these mechanisms. I think quadratic voting is fantastic because we move beyond this notion of one person, one vote, and let people express the intensity of how much they care about an issue across a range of issues. And we like this because it introduces markets in voting without money or the concentrating cost of capital. And it does this by square rooting votes to enable us to price influence proportional to marginal cost, so the next unit of influence costs more. And I think this mechanism will become increasingly important as we enter a future of increasing returns phenomena, where marginal input leads to greater marginal output, like physical infrastructure and digital infrastructure, like AI, for examples, and where other mechanisms like one token, one vote, or $1, one vote, leads plutocrats to have outsized influence and power over what are essentially shared network goods, whose value arises from people using them and contributing to them. So I would say that's like one really important mechanism in SolarPunk. Another one that has been less explored, which I'm curious if you've seen explored more recently in Web3, is harbinger taxation. And to sort of just quickly recap on what that is, that's when owners periodically self-assess their property and pay a tax on its value, and anyone else can kind of come along and purchase that property from the owner, forcing a sale. And this is interesting because it's not private ownership, it's not common ownership, it's something in between partial ownership. And what's nice about it is that monopoly rents that would otherwise accrue to owners and their generations afterwards get reinvested back into communities, that again regenerate that value to fund innovation and education and so on. So I'm curious, Kevin, actually, have you seen harbinger taxation much in Web3?
Yeah, there's a project that I'm aware of, Nifty Apes, that is using it as a mechanism that allows you to borrow against your NFT, and then it's partial common ownership. So I've seen it used in a couple places. The other example is Simon de la Roubier's This Artwork Is Always on Sale, an NFT that you can buy, but then you've got to pay harbinger taxes in order to keep it. So I'm definitely more of the quadratic funding, quadratic voting guy in Web3, but I've seen a little bit of harbinger taxes as well.
Yeah, and so those are great examples. It can be applied not just to monopolies and land, but sort of any positional good or any goods that accrue value because of status, like art or like even ad space. So what I think SolarPunk misses or kind of doesn't totally get is, yes, the sun is this sort of symbol of regeneration, but it can also be this symbol of oppression, right? And there's some truth to that. If there's no privacy, then there's surveillance, and surveillance can lead to manipulation, which collapses us to some version of authoritarianism or technocracy by an elite. For example, in the case of quadratic voting, if all your votes are visible and your preferences are known, you can easily be bribed in some off-chain communication channel or some side channel. And of course, the most vulnerable to this are those voters who are most likely to be indifferent and just vote like a coin toss. So that's my criticism of SolarPunk. I'm not sure if you agree with that characterization at all, but that's kind of my starting point. What do you think?
Yes, I mean, I think just to read it back for the audience, SolarPunk is, first off, I think these all different permutations of punk are more of a vibe than they are a hard and fast category. So SolarPunk is this idea of like a high-tech, high utopia, high sustainability version of the world that we could be building with Web3 that basically uses mechanisms like quadratic funding, quadratic voting, and harbinger taxes in order to support the public good, to support sustainability. And just to play that back, the weaknesses are privacy, and what do we do in which there's in a world in which there's an authoritarian government looking at which public goods we fund and creating a social credit system or something on top of that is the criticism of SolarPunk. So that's what I heard from you. And to answer your question, do I think it's fair? Yes and no. I mean, I think it is true that we want to have a world in which we fund public goods in an adversarial environment where there is privacy. But I also think that SolarPunk is more of a vibe than a hard and fast category. And so it just really depends on how you draw the lines, and like vibes don't really have, aesthetics don't really have hard and fast lines around them. So maybe there's a version of SolarPunk that does have privacy, and it's just not really well represented in the aesthetic. Would be my volley back to you.
Yeah, and maybe that's Stellarpunk because the sun is also a star.
So let's work our way towards Stellarpunk. Maybe we should talk about Lunarpunk next.
Yeah. So my framing of SolarPunk is actually basically what the Lunarpunks are saying about SolarPunk. So the Lunarpunks like to frame themselves as the skeptics, and this is kind of like the dark buy group, and they frame SolarPunks as the optimists. And the major push in the Lunarpunk movement I see is going dark and building these private anonymous systems to subvert surveillance and control by like nation states and big tech. And the idea here is for users to go dark and hide themselves in dark forest of encryption and live as an anon. And Lunarpunks see this feedback loop between anonymity and surveillance, that will ultimately legitimate crypto. I would say the embodiments of this like ethos is actually like early Bitcoin, which kind of considered itself as community with sea of anons. What do I see the weaknesses of this? Well, if SolarPunk's weakness, according to Lunarpunk, is surveillance, I would say Lunarpunk's weakness is hidden collusion. So civilization isn't coordinated by sea of anons who don't know anything about each other. In fact, those parties that do choose to reveal information about themselves to other parties. Sorry, Kevin, I can hear some feedback, just FYI. In fact, so what was I saying? Yeah, so civilization isn't really coordinated by like a sea of anons. It's those parties that choose to actually reveal some information about themselves to counterparties that are better able to form agreements or credible commitments. In other words, it's much easier to build economies, wealth, and cooperation on trust, and it's pretty close to impossible to play repeat games of pure anonymity without reputation, where defectors and bad actors can strategically breach agreements and like spin up new accounts. So what ends up happening with Lunarpunk? Well, the reality is we're social beings with social ties, we talk. And even though Bitcoin is a sort of a sea of anons, right, there are Telegram channels where miners and pool operators can collude, and we get shadow governance and shadow arrangements between anons who communicate and have social ties with each other. In other words, we get collusion and those that collude best accrete power over everyone else, which leaves us with dark, hidden, opaque governance games. And, who really wants that? I'd say that there's also this like other, as an extension of the collusion problem, there's another weakness of Lunarpunk, which is its focus on the individual and individual privacy and anonymity. And this doesn't really address the fact that people come together as groups and produce shared conversational data, which they have to agree on as a group what's private. And in a sense, the data already isn't private, but public to the group that generated it. So it's partially private. And this group has to decide how much of that data do they want to expose to the rest of the world, in what form, and in what privacy-preserving method. So Lunarpunk's emphasis on the sovereign individual and personal anonymity overlooks much of this shared data, which requires groups thinking about governance. And in my opinion, getting privacy right means thinking about groups and how they can encode these privacy expectations together and credibly commit to how and under what conditions information was revealed. And so what Lunarpunk misses is that coordination isn't so much built on encrypted sovereign individuals, but is more built on these partial privacy games of individuals within groups and groups negotiating with other groups. Curious what you think of that characterization before I move on to SolarPunk.
Yeah, I think it's fair. And I think that these things are more aesthetics and vibes than they are hard and fast categories. But in the Lunarpunk criticism of SolarPunk, the weakness of SolarPunk is privacy, and Lunarpunk is meant to address that by giving people these shrouds of privacy and bringing back individualistic protections against authoritarian governments by creating privacy technologies. But in that shroud of darkness, what does that do for introducing the ability for people to collude and unfairly route funds to projects that the colluders or the attackers are favor? And so I think that's a fair criticism of Lunarpunk, but also, maybe there's configurable privacy in which you have privacy by default, but there's some amounts of anti-collusion mechanism that could be built into Lunarpunk, again, because this is a vibe and not really a hard and fast category. Or the narrative is like, it feels like 100 miles ahead of the memes here, or ahead of the mechanisms here. So maybe we'll come up with mechanisms that have both public goods funding and privacy and collusion in the future. And I don't know, maybe those mechanism propagators, we'll call them SolarPunk, Lunarpunk, or something else at that point. It's hard to draw lines between these things.
Yeah. So, okay. So, shall I move on to Stellarpunk?
Yes, let's get to the meat of the episode. So Stellarpunk, what is Stellarpunk and why are you excited about it?
Yeah. So, well, should we start with some memes first?
Of course. Yeah.
Okay.
Obviously.
So if SolarPunk is considered the conscious and Lunarpunk is considered the unconscious, I would say Stellarpunk is the third eye. Or if SolarPunk is light and Lunarpunk is dark, I would say Stellarpunk is a rainbow. If SolarPunk is publicity and Lunarpunk is privacy, I would say Stellarpunk is the superposition of both, of partial publicity and partial privacy.
These are very plural memes that you're coming up with here.
Yeah. Hopefully you can build better memes and move them into existence. So let's actually take this analogy of stars literally. So on the surface, we look like these self-sovereign stars, right? And we're emanating these idiosyncratic beliefs and desires through space-time. And just as light obeys this inverse square law, so it doesn't drown out the light of other stars, we also similarly square root over the intensity of our lights, our individual lights, so we can differentiate and see other people's light, right? And so this is the quadratic aspect of SolarPunk. The sun is actually a star. So far, so good?
Yeah, so I think that I just think the analogy of quadratic funding and your votes decaying by the amount of capital that you have over time quadratically, and this analogy of how stars radiating out light into the universe, the brightness of that decays quadratically over the distance over time. That's just like a really beautiful analogy to me. But yes, I'm tracking so far. So would love to continue.
It's not quadratic. It's like an inverse square law. Close enough. It's close enough, right?
Okay.
Same logic. So Stellarpunk takes another step. So we build on this SolarPunk. We build on this quadratic aspect, but we do something else because light isn't just a particle, right? It's also a wave and has properties instantaneously entangled with other light waves or their spin across vast distances. So what we want to know is underneath the intensity of our seemingly idiosyncratic, unique preferences, or what I'm calling our light, how correlated is our light or our spin or our bias with other people's light waves by this invisible, messy, stochastic social process we call communication? And we want to know these hidden correlations, especially when digital communication accelerates our entanglements across distance as we enter social media spin zones or YouTube rabbit holes, et cetera, et cetera. So what Stellarpunk does is rather than treat people as the same uncorrelated, non-conversational sovereign individual or sovereign star without social ties, we take an extra step. We cluster people by their conversational overlap and similarity, and then discount their influence based off the shared conversational memberships as well as revealed behavior. In other words, we don't treat 100 duped puppets or 100 mindless bots in the same spin zone, having the same narrow clustered conversations, the same as, for example, a highly intersectional person debating across very different groups. Instead, we acknowledge correlated conversational groups and discount them against them in voting. And so with this kind of correlation discounting, we address the collusion weakness of Lunarpunk, and we turn governance into this prism, allowing communities to bend and refract what is otherwise incoming monolithic light into differentiated colors, so we can see the unique colors of less biased and less correlated perspectives sharply and in their full brilliance. So that was a mouthful. I will pause and let you ask some questions.
Well, it feels like in this framing, if SolarPunk is the sun and it's high utopia and high regeneration, and Lunarpunk is the criticism of that incorporates privacy. It feels like you're positioning Stellarpunk, which is the whole night sky, as being plurality. So it's not about one central authoritarian sun. It's about the plurality of all of the different stars in the sky. And I think that there's just sort of a beautiful metaphor there of this being something that transcends SolarPunk and Lunarpunk into the plurality of all the different ways that we're different and diverse from each other. And I think that it's just kind of it's a beautiful metaphor, and maybe that's just because my dad's an astronomer that I have an appreciation for the night sky. But I'm wondering how you think it's different from Solar and Lunarpunk.
Well, so I talked about like just this, it's different from SolarPunk because you have quadratic voting, right? But you have these correlation discounts that let you see kind of underneath how correlated our lights are. We're all different stars, right? And lets you sort of discount against the correlated to actually see more colors and more brilliance and see more plurality, right? But there's on the Lunarpunk side, there's this question still of privacy. How does Stellarpunk avoid Lunarpunk's like total privacy and anonymity, right? That doesn't really recognize shared group data, right? And also avoid this other extreme of SolarPunk's like total publicity, right? Which could open us up to, right, surveillance and control. So maybe I can go back to this idea of like wave particle duality and dig a little bit deeper here. So in the same way light has this like wave particle duality, you can see individuals as like intersections or networks of groups, and you can also see groups as networks of individuals, right? So Stellarpunk, in addition to acknowledging, our individual particle nature, we also acknowledge groups or our wave nature. And importantly, what we do is we represent membership to groups with socially programmable objects that confer rights of participation, and importantly, make explicit the community's governance mechanism. Is it governance, one person, one vote? Is it quadratic vote? Is it like token voting, right? And this governance mechanism helps us determine what information the community or group chooses to reveal and to whom and in exchange for what. Money or information from another group, for example, right? So in other words, having this object confers the right to vote on a group's privacy. And a constellation of these objects represents your access and governance over all the channels you participate in. And you can call them soul-bound because they represent your access and no one else's, or you can call them community-bound as communities grant and program these objects. So again, like wave particle duality, individuals and communities are also to the same phenomena. And once we represent governance, right, the next step is to actually improve it to price influence, right? And here we use quadratic voting like SolarPunk, but we augment it with correlation discounts. So again, rather than treating people as the same uncorrelated sovereign individual, or isolated star without social ties, without correlations, Stellarpunk looks at the wave nature of networked individuals and takes an extra step and discounts influence based off of shared conversational clusters, right, as I just previously discussed. And so we get this collusion-resistant quadratic voting, letting people express their intensity of their preferences, but also correcting for their biases. And this collusion resistance really matters for privacy, because when a community is negotiating to share their data with another community, it may have overlapping members and a conflict of interest. Or when it decides to, say, auction off or federate some of their data to a third party, the community may have overlapping shareholders. But when communities rely on this prism of collusion resistance, right, as a governance mechanism, the information that gets shared is actually more likely to be in the community's broader interest than any cluster's narrow private interest. And this is really important when building, decentralized systems, because you don't want a cluster to gain an information or control toehold over other clusters, right? And collusion-resistant voting makes these hidden toeholds in power that can grow into like black hole singularities much less likely. So sorry, that was a quite a bit of rant. I will stop and let you ask questions.
Well, is this too reductionist? Would it be fair to say that Stellarpunk is meant to overcome the problems with SolarPunk, which is privacy, and the problems with Lunarpunk, which is collusion, and sort of bridge both of those divides to create a best of both worlds?
Yeah, I think the sun, moon, and stars are all part of the same universe, right? And so Stellarpunk draws on the virtues of SolarPunk and the virtues of LunarPunk, but also compensates for their weaknesses. And in particular, like it compensates for the weaknesses of SolarPunks, like say quadratic voting by having correlation discounts, but also thinking about privacy from the perspective of collusion resistance, right? And the same thing with LunarPunk. Like, whereas LunarPunk has the sort of opposite problem of total privacy and anonymity and hidden collusion, right? Collusion resistance and quadratic voting like brings that out and surfaces that, right? But in a way that doesn't swallow everything into singularity.
The other thing that you said, which struck me as quite profound, is this idea in physics that we have a wave-particle duality, which is basically just a way of saying that an electron can be, or particles can be represented as a wave, and then also as a particle. And one of the things I think is interesting in advanced physics is breaking this duality. And as we apply these metaphors to social systems, to political economies, this idea that of like a holon breaks the duality between an individual and a collective. We are both collectives of cells and individuals in ourselves, and so the idea that an individual and a collective are part of the same stack and are part of the same ecology, and comparing that to wave-particle duality, I think that's quite profound in how we're using these physical metaphors for complex social systems. So that's definitely a pickup for me.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say we're trying to break the duality, at least recognize, but more so recognize it. And so you can look at a phenomena in two different ways, right? And you can look at light and its behavior as a particle. You can look at light and its behavior as a wave, right? And they're seemingly in contradiction, but you have to, if you kind of look at it from one angle and not from the other, then you're missing the full picture. And so what I was saying is, we as humans, you can look at us as, individuals, but really we're individuals and we're differentiated by the conversational groups and we're part of. So individuals are networks of groups, right? But you should also think the other view, the community view or community-bound view, right? And look at communities as just networks of individuals. And once you take both of these perspectives, then you can really start to build richer substrates that capture socially programmable privacy and plurality and expand the possibility space of not just one sun or one moon, but to like many different stars, right? And key to doing that is recognizing groups and enabling groups to, actually represent, govern, and acknowledge what is, make explicit that they are they're producing something together as a group, and that group, whether data, conversational data, and empowering them to govern it in a collusion-resistant way that actually, taking it a step deeper, refracts out, what seems like maybe monolithic majoritarian light in a group and refracts different colors, so we can get agreements and consensus across difference to build shared network goods that benefit many people rather than, a cluster that might just accrue more power.
Yeah, I think that there's another sort of analog here where you were talking about taking white light and breaking it out into its composite colors that just reminds me of a rainbow, which I think has been a symbol of plurality for many people, and this idea of delighting in our basic differences. And I'm wondering if you could say more about the rainbow and it as a symbol of plurality.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's the perfect symbol. And I'm not sure if I could say more. I mean, I was thinking, I had this insight that if you, the problem with quadratic voting, and you know this with Gitcoin, right, is groups that are just more coordinated can come and like take advantage of the mechanism. So if a group with like 90% participation with everybody giving like $1 can swamp a group that has 20% participation, even though they might be giving $10 each, right? And so what you want to do is correct for these over-coordinated groups, right? And sort of surface them. And in Bitcoin, I'm sure you're struggling with this all the time to sort of surface the hidden collusions, right? And once you do that, you actually start to see the different voices of the actually different, intersectional individuals or communities. And if you kind of, what correlation discounting does is it takes a consensus amongst these sort of very different lights, the red, blues, and greens, and say, okay, what do all these different lights, colors agree on? And then agrees to, that as a proposal, and that becomes the shared public good, or a proposal most likely to advance a shared public good. And so it's, the challenge in social processes is to always really kind of untangle or disentangle what seems like one monolithic light and actually see, okay, actually what's underneath here, where are there differences, where is there collusion, and correct for that to enable, ongoing and building plurality.
So it feels like there's a thin line between coordination and collusion, and disentangling that is a struggle.
Well, I would say like all coordination is collusion, and like all collusion is coordination. It's not really a question of like, from your perspective, there's some coordination that's like bad coordination, but from my perspective, it might be good coordination, right? Depending on our different interests and different beliefs and different desires and our objectives. And so the question is, it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. Then how do you actually figure out what is in the, groups, communities, or public's interest? And what's in the communities, groups, or public's interest is what very different people who are conversationally very far apart agree on as being, something beneficial for the community, rather than kind of a hidden, narrow, private, narrow conversational cluster agreeing on that. It's more likely to be something that's, beneficial to their interest. But when you take very conversationally distant people, it's more likely to be in the general interest. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So it's building the idea of cooperation across social distance, or in the Stellarpunk analogy, I think getting the light of many stars over one star into the mechanism.
Yeah, I mean, the analogies sort of break down, but you can say about many stars, but it's more like many stars that are not like, entangled.
Right. This is what happens when you get two engineers and analytical thinkers trying to create memes, is that we're pointing out already the flaws in the analogies. But I watched your talk about Stellarpunk at the Plurality conference, and I thought it was quite profound. And we'll link it in the show notes for the listeners who wanna check it out. I like this idea of having many North Stars and building plurality into our punkness, instead of SolarPunk and LunarPunk. This idea of Stellarpunk, the whole night sky, is the vibe that we're going after. And I'm just so thankful to you for creating this meme. I mean, obviously your contributions to the space have been much more to that, but I think Stellarpunk is a really cool vibe, and happy to add it to the punk series we've been running.
Thank you so much. And again, it's not to the exclusion of LunarPunk or SolarPunk, but actually embracing those, seeing their place in the universe as well. And
they're part of Stellarpunk, yeah.
They are part of Stellarpunk. There is a place for individual privacy, and there's also a place for publicity as well. But there's also this bigger place for, partial privacy and partialities. And even like you can think about harbinger taxation being as a case of like, partial ownership in the same and in the same line. And when you get like, a world of like partial privacy, partial ownership, and partial information, right? No one star or no one person has kind of the same perspective as anybody else. And it's by, finding consensus across these many multiple perspectives that we can build more resilient networks, and in a, robust, sustainable way that decentralizes power and doesn't let things, get swallowed into a black hole.
Yeah. I love this picture that you're painting, and, maybe it's because my old man is an astronomer, but what would a more Stellarpunk world look like? So take us forward to 2030 in a world in which Stellarpunk is maximally successful. Are we harbors or taxing and quadratic voting and quadratic funding, all the things? What does that world look like?
Or collusion discounting like crazy. No, I mean, I think it's actually it's an interesting question. So the challenge with collusion discounts is you have to get a sense of how correlated people are in their conversational clusters, and that's like a combination of ex ante and ex post social clustering, looking at their commitments, their commitments to groups, but also their revealed behavior. And so it's a super tricky problem. And so I can't say like how the mechanism it will evolve. I mean, we're still very early, and I think Joel, who you had on earlier, is doing a lot of great work there. But how does the world look? I would say it's definitely more colorful. If you notice in my talks, I use a lot of color, and less black, right? Less black and white, more color. You can also just see it when you start to look at the world and in terms of where are the hidden correlations, not just in like beliefs, which people are in the same sort of algorithmic spin zone, right? But also in terms of like physical architecture or like art or like buildings, right? And like plurality, we should see more, diversity there and like richness, right? And I notice as I like travel, to some cities are kind of like artificial and built, and you can tell it's like the same contractor, set of contractors, right? Or owned by the same financial hold company that built that, or you go to like a coastline in Cancun or something versus like another part of Mexico, and you can see it's like, okay, like there's clearly like one or some subset of people that just sort of own everything and like are imputing their preferences right on this. And I think in plurality, we see not just an expression of more individual preferences, but social preferences recombining into like more novel and interesting forms of art and creativity and like novel forms of architecture and people expressing themselves in very cool and unique recombinatorial ways. So, I mean, the possibility, I think I will be happy if like in 2030, we kind of like move away from the aesthetics of, the Brooklyn coffee shop that has just been replicated all around the world, right? Copy and pasted. And we just see more like colorful instantiations that combine like local knowledge and local customs, like that are intersectional with, other cultures and more fusions and recombinations. So not sure if I painted a good picture there, but that's what I hope to see.
Yeah, it's a beautiful picture. I can taste the rainbow as you're speaking. Is there anything I didn't ask about Stellarpunk that you want to say?
Sure. Actually, there's one kind of like cool announcement. There is a Plural Communication Cooperative, the PCC, and the group has made this like fun discourse fork, which allows you to express the intensity of your preference with hearts, but at the same time, it recognizes and discounts the social cluster you are part of based on correlation factors set by the community you are part of, whether it be like workplace, geography, or maybe political affiliation. And we've made this like open source, and I'll send it to you, the GitHub. And we would love for communities to experiment with it, especially DAOs and Web3. Again, the point is like, so, minority voices don't get drowned out, and communities can surface questions which multiple perspectives agree on is interesting. And it's a playful first step, but we think it's, a nice experiment for communities to kind of get comfortable with collusion-resistant mechanisms and what we call like plurality scores, which is just kind of a fancy or more familiar word for, quadratic voting with correlation discounts. So I will share that with you.
That's great. Yeah, we'll put that in the show notes. The audience can check it out. And I just love this idea of making pluralism more practical by creating tools that are more Stellarpunk, that have plurality baked into them and just make it easier to coordinate in a more plural way. So we'll add that to the list.
Yeah, and it's actually particularly great for, if you're a DAO or if you're in like a protocol ecosystem and you really want to run a kind of like pluralistic or decentralized conference with agendas, right? It's a really great bottom-up way to get community consensus on what should be the agenda, that's multiple perspectives agree on. And it's a great way to also sort of decentralize power away from those who like own a lot of tokens and a lot of influence, and move these systems in a more pluralistic direction.
I love it. Like I said, I can taste the rainbow.
Okay, thank you so much.
That's my meme I'm going to end on. Thank you so much for appearing to do the Stellarpunk podcast. Also, everything you've done in the space around decentralized society, plurality research. Really looking forward to see how things evolve over time. So big fan, Puja. Keep up the great work.
Thank you, Kevin. Bye-bye.
Peace and love.